Oh, welcome. Take a seat and relax for a moment. You must be tired from your long journey. Today, I'm going to tell you a story hidden in the dusty pages of time, one that not many people know. The Children's Crusade. Yes, children, innocent hearts who set out to save Jerusalem, believing they could change the world. But this story isn't a hero's tale. It's the story of how a journey that started with hope turned into tragedy. This story is not just a page from history, but also a mirror of a time when humanity was tested by innocence, faith, and manipulation. Now close your eyes and listen. Because in this ancient tale, we may not only find the past, but perhaps even ourselves. My children, every story has a beginning. To understand the tragic story of the Children's Crusade, we must first look at the bigger picture and understand the ground where these events took root. Listen closely, because this story holds the key to understanding how humanity has shaped itself for the sake of faith and power. History takes us to the late 11th century. Europe, a continent plagued by wars, hunger, and despair. A world ruled by feudal lords where most people depended on the mercy of landowners. But at the same time, it was an era when the church was much more than just a spiritual guide. The church was both the voice of God and a worldly power. And sometimes this power shaped politics more than faith itself. At that time, the Christian world felt threatened. Muslim armies from the east had taken control of the Holy Land, especially Jerusalem, the holiest city for Christians, where Christ was believed to have been crucified and resurrected. Its control by the Muslims was seen as both a religious disgrace and a political threat to Christian leaders in Europe. Pope Urban II stood up at the Council of Clermont in 1095 and addressed the people. "God wills it," he cried. He called for the formation of a Crusader army to reclaim Jerusalem. This call ignited not only a military campaign, but also a desire to save the souls of people, because in those days, joining a holy war meant forgiveness of sins and a place in heaven. When the church made this promise, people from all over Europe, whether rich or poor, noble or peasant, became captivated by the same dream, to go to Jerusalem and fight in the name of God. But this call wasn't just religious enthusiasm. At the time, Europe was undergoing economic and social changes. Due to land ownership, population growth, and limited resources, conflicts were increasing. Feudal lords were seeking new lands and riches through war. Peasants, on the other hand, wanted to join the crusade in hopes of a better life. In short, the Crusades were both a religious mission and a reflection of worldly interests. Thus, the dream of reclaiming Jerusalem turned into a long-lasting cycle of wars. The First Crusade began in 1096, and Christians captured Jerusalem. But this victory didn't last long. Muslims, under leaders like Saladin, retook the Holy Land. Both sides fought in the name of God, but in reality this war was more about power and the desire for land than faith itself. The Crusades weren't just a series of wars. This movement transformed Europe. Trade routes expanded, cultural exchanges increased, and new ideas were brought to Europe. But at the same time, it led to great suffering, destruction, and the loss of innocent lives. Understanding this background is important because the faith and enthusiasm that led the children to embark on their journey were shaped in these years. To grasp how powerful and at the same time destructive faith can be when combined with innocence, we must understand this historical context. Now we are ready to discuss how the children became part of this saga. But before we do, let's pause for a moment and think about this story. Does faith unite people, or does it divide and destroy? We will continue our journey to find the answer to this question. My children. As we talk about the Crusades, we come to one of the strangest and most tragic pages in history. The Children's Crusade. Even the name brings a series of questions to mind, doesn't it? Children. Are they going to a holy war? Why? How? First, we need to understand what this movement was all about. In 1212, two separate movements emerged in two different parts of Europe, in Germany and France, led by young people. These young people decided to set out on a journey to reclaim Jerusalem and fulfill God's will. But these crusades were very different from the ones before. This wasn't an army organized by nobles, nor was it an official initiative supported by the church. Instead, this movement was shaped by the enthusiasm of the common people, particularly the youth and children. So, why do we call it the Children's Crusade? It's important to clarify a misunderstanding here. The term children might imply that the movement was made up entirely of small children, but in reality, these groups included people of different ages. Yes, there were children between the ages of 12-15, but there were also young adults, peasants, and even some older people who joined this movement. The word children symbolized innocence and pure faith. Leaders of this movement, like Nicholas and Stephen, were seen as prophets by the people. And so, what set this movement apart from other crusades was that it wasn't based on military strength. They didn't have weapons and they weren't trained. All they had was their unwavering faith in God. They believed that God would perform miracles. In fact, they even believed that the waters of the Mediterranean would part, allowing them to walk to Jerusalem. This is an example of how powerful, yet dangerous, innocence and faith can be. But this innocence also made them vulnerable. In previous crusades, armies were under the command of leaders, and logistical planning had been done. But in the Children's Crusade, none of that existed. They set off without any leadership structure, without even considering basic needs like food and shelter. From the very beginning, this was a recipe for disaster. Now think about it. A group of children and young people set off, battling hunger and disease. So, what led to this movement? The answer lies in the beliefs and hopes of the people at that time. In Europe, ordinary people were tired of the failure of previous crusades. The nobles and church leaders had not been able to reclaim the Holy Land, so they believed that pure and innocent people, like children, would be more valuable in God's eyes. So when they heard that God had delivered the lost land, they mercifully agreed to dedicate their lives to the mission. They were trusting their heroes. This belief created a wave of public support for a movement led by children. But history teaches us this: innocence and faith do not always bring victory. The Children's Crusade is not a heroic epic. It is a tragedy. These innocent young people were not only victims of their own dreams, but also of the chaotic conditions of their time. As you listen to this story, try to understand not only the past, but also human nature. How far can faith take people? And when does this faith turn into a dangerous delusion? These questions will take us deep into the heart of this tragic story. Children, now get ready to learn how this movement started, who led it, and what tragic endings it led to. This is not just the story of children, but the story of humanity. Ah, my children. Now I will take you to that complex and turbulent period in history. The year 1212, a time when Europe was trapped between faith and despair. The hearts of people were filled with belief, but their minds were shadowed by fear. And it was under these conditions that an extraordinary movement, the Children's Crusade, was born. By the time we reached 1212, many religious and social movements were sweeping across Europe. The church played a central role in the lives of the people, but it was also a great authority. The Pope was not only a spiritual leader, but also a political power. The church's power sometimes united people, but at other times it divided them. The Crusades were one of the church's biggest projects, but most of the previous ones had either failed or not met expectations. Jerusalem had been lost to the Christians, and this had shaken the morale of Christians in Europe. But among the people there was something else, a deep faith and a search for salvation. At that time there were many stories about apocalyptic prophecies, miracles, and holy signs. People were waiting for God's intervention, and this anticipation sparked great enthusiasm, especially among the lower classes. These people were trapped in the hardships of daily life: Hunger, poverty, and war shaped their lives. Their faith in God offered a way out of these struggles. Now think about this. At that time, ordinary peasants and young people believed that a miracle was about to happen. And this belief suddenly caught fire. In Germany, a young shepherd named Nicholas claimed to have received a message from God. In France, another young man named Stephen started to influence the people in the same way. These young people, with their innocence and enthusiasm, won the hearts of the people. The people believed that these young people were God's chosen ones. So how did the church leaders react to these movements? This is where things get interesting. The church initially viewed these movements with suspicion. The movements initiated by these children and young people were developing outside the control of the church. Pope Innocent III did not officially support the movement, but he also didn't oppose it entirely. Suppressing such a movement which had created such enthusiasm among the people could harm the church's authority. But the people, they greeted this movement with great hope, because in their eyes this movement came from pure faith. In a place where the nobles and the church had failed, they believed that the innocent youth would succeed. The people not only supported these children, but also bestowed upon them a sacred mission. They gave them food, prayed for them, and scattered roses in their path. But we must not forget that this movement was born not only from faith, but also from the social conditions of the time. The pressure of the feudal system, famine, and war had intensified the despair within the people. They had found hope in the innocence of the children, and so in such a period the Children's Crusade emerged. This movement was not only a reflection of religious fervor, but also a reflection of societal desperation. Now we are ready to talk about how these children set out on their journey and the challenges they faced. But let's pause for a moment and think. How far can faith take people? And when does that faith turn into a delusion? These are the questions that lie at the heart of this story. My children, now I will take you to the two enchanted lands where the Children's Crusade began, Germany and France. These two countries, though seemingly independent in the same year, bore witness to the birth of two movements shaped by the same wave of faith. Each one emerged from the charisma of a different leader and the pure belief of the people. But both were tragically driven toward the same fate. Let's first look at Germany. In Germany, there was a young shepherd named Nicholas. Who was this Nicholas? History tells us very little about him, but in the memory of the people, he has become a figure akin to a prophet. Nicholas was no ordinary shepherd. He believed that he had been chosen by God. One day, while tending his sheep in the mountains, he claimed to have had a vision from God. In this vision, God gave him the task of rescuing the Holy Land. As Nicholas began to share this message with the people, a great crowd quickly gathered around him. People were captivated by the faith and enthusiasm in his words. Farmers, peasants, even children followed him. Nicholas believed that God would create miracles and that Jerusalem would be freed without the shedding of blood. He thought that God's will would part the waters of the Mediterranean, and these innocent people, like Moses crossing the Red Sea, would walk to the Holy Land. Nicholas' leadership was not based on a soldier's discipline, but rather on the charisma of a prophet. The people who followed him were not only children. Peasants in their hunger and despair were searching for salvation, and they found that salvation in the words of this young shepherd. Now let's turn to France. In France, another young man, Stephen of Cloyes, emerged with a similar story. Stephen was only 12 years old. He lived in a small village and one day claimed that God had sent him a message. This message was to be delivered to the King of France. Stephen went before the king and told him God's will. However, the king did not take the words of this young child seriously and sent him back. But this was not the end of Stephen's story. On the contrary, this event only increased his fame. The people began to see Stephen as a saint. His innocence and pure faith ignited the imagination of the people. As Stephen traveled from village to village delivering God's message, a growing crowd followed him. This crowd was mostly made up of peasants, young people, and children. Stephen's leadership was similar to Nicholas's, but also different. While Nicholas influenced the people with his belief in God's miracles, Stephen's innocence and charisma enchanted the people. His words echoed in the hearts of the people. Yet both leaders shared one common point. They represented the hopes and beliefs of the people. At that time, people believed that the liberation of the Holy Land could only be achieved by the hands of the innocent and the faithful. Therefore, both Nicholas and Stephen were seen as saviors in the eyes of the people. But from the very beginning of this story, we can see that it is heading toward tragedy. For no matter how faithful and charismatic these leaders were, they had neither logistics nor a strategic plan. Their leadership relied on miracles, and miracles do not always happen. Now imagine, behind these two young leaders, a crowd full of hope sets off on a journey. But will this journey truly be one of salvation? Or will it be a disaster? These questions will find their answers as the story unfolds. My children, now I will take you to the great hopes carried by those innocent hearts. The deepest power behind the Children's Crusade was the unwavering faith of these young people and their devotion to miracles. So, what was the source of this faith? And what motivated these innocent souls to embark on a journey to Jerusalem? First, we must understand the spiritual atmosphere of the time. Europe in those years was a place where miracles of God were believed to occur frequently. People saw the signs in the sky, messages from sacred texts, and the lives of saints as divine guidance. The sermons of the church fueled these beliefs. The church constantly emphasized the importance of Jerusalem for the Christian world and called on the people to rescue this holy land. But the children, their faith was purer and more unshakable than that of adults. They had not yet learned the complexities of the world. For them, God's miracles were not something to be questioned, but an obvious truth. The desire to rescue Jerusalem was a mission, a calling in their innocent hearts. Leaders like Nicholas and Stephen kindled this faith that burned within the young. Their words strengthened the belief in miracles. Nicholas claimed that God would part the waters of the Mediterranean and that the children would walk to the Holy Land. This was a miracle similar to Moses crossing the Red Sea. The children believed with all their hearts that this miracle would come true. Stephen, on the other hand, claimed that God had sent him a message, and this message needed to be heard by the king. His declaration created great excitement among the children. Because this message was not just a mission, it was the beginning of a miracle. The sermons further reinforced this belief. The priests of the church preached about the sanctity of the Crusades and how God would support these missions. Influenced by these sermons, the children began to see themselves as part of God's army. This army didn't need weapons, but innocence and faith. However, it wasn't just the sermons that affected them. At that time, visions and dreams held great importance among the people. Many children claimed that God or saints had appeared to them and called them to a sacred mission. These visions further strengthened their belief, for it was a sign that God had chosen them. The children's religious fervor was not just an individual belief. This fervor became a social movement. The children influenced each other and gave one another courage. The movement grew in a domino effect, spreading across Europe. But let us pause and think for a moment. What exactly did these children believe in? They set off to rescue Jerusalem. But did they truly understand the hardships, hunger, thirst, and dangers that lay ahead? No, they didn't. For in their eyes, this journey was to be a miracle, protected by God's grace. And here, the most poignant aspect of this story emerges. While the children's faith was pure and powerful, it was vulnerable to the harsh realities of the world. Their enthusiasm was the driving force that sent them on their journey, but that same enthusiasm was also their weakness. Now think about this. How far can faith take a person? And when does that faith turn into a disillusionment? Was the pure faith carried by these children their strength, or the beginning of their tragedy? These questions reveal the profound meaning of the Children's Crusade. Ah, the children, symbols of innocence and faith. But this innocence could not shield them from the harsh realities of the world. Now I will take you on that hopeful, yet tragically difficult journey. Across the rugged lands of Europe, these young souls walked in pursuit of their dreams. Yet this journey was far more challenging than they had ever imagined. It all began with great enthusiasm. The children passing through villages and towns, each set out to fulfill their sacred mission. With simple crosses in their hands and almost nothing on their backs, they trusted in God's protection and believed they could overcome any hardship. However, this pure faith left them unprepared for the challenges ahead. The first major issue was logistics. Most of these children had not packed enough food or water for the journey. They believed that God would provide for their needs. But the lands of Europe tested this faith. Long walks turned hunger into their greatest enemy. Finding food was almost impossible. The children tried to pluck a few heads of grain from the fields, gather wild fruit from the forests, but it was never enough to feed such a large crowd. Along with hunger came disease. Malnutrition, exhaustion from the long walks, and a lack of clean water weakened many of the children. Bodies feverish with illness, these innocent bodies could not withstand the harshness of the road. The group grew smaller each day. Some died by the roadside, while others were forced to turn back. But turning back was not an option for most. They believed this journey was a sacred mission, and abandoning it would be seen as a betrayal. Another challenge arose from the reactions of the local populations. As the children passed through towns and villages, they sought the mercy of the local people. Some offered food and shelter to these innocent travelers. Yet not everyone showed the same compassion. In some regions, the locals saw this crowd as a threat. Villagers unwilling to let the children pass through their lands chased them away. Others saw an opportunity in the situation. Rather than helping the vulnerable children, they exploited them. Along the journey, the cohesion of the group became an issue. The leaders struggled to keep the large crowd together. Children of various ages and backgrounds began to clash. Hunger and exhaustion had drained their patience. This division further weakened the group. Despite all these difficulties, the children pressed on, for in their hearts there remained hope. They believed they would reach Jerusalem and witness God's miracles. This belief was the only thing that kept them going. Now think about this. These innocent souls were trying to stand tall with nothing but their faith. But how far could that faith truly take them? The harsh roads of Europe tested their innocence and determination. Would those who survived this trial truly reach Jerusalem? Every journey tells a story, but this one was a tale woven with both hope and tragedy. Each step the children took spoke of their belief in a miracle, and yet also told of the cruel truths of the world. Ah, Marseille and Genoa. These port cities on the southern edge of Europe, carrying the salty winds of the Mediterranean, became the crossroads of the children's hopes and disappointments. Exhausted bodies, weary souls, and an unwavering faith led this innocent crowd to these cities. But their arrival was not the end of their journey. It was perhaps the beginning of the most difficult part. The children who reached Marseille believed their journey to Jerusalem would now continue by sea. They thought the Mediterranean would part with God's help, just as the Red Sea had for Moses, allowing them to miraculously reach the Holy Land. But the sea, as always, did not bow to human will. The miracle did not occur. The waves remained still, and the sea still appeared vast and insurmountable. At this point, the roles of trade routes and the port cities came into play. Marseille and Genoa were the heart of Mediterranean trade at the time. Ships carrying spices, fabrics, and precious metals anchored daily at their docks, with merchants transporting these riches across Europe. But these cities were also home to opportunists and exploiters. The children knew they needed ships to reach Jerusalem, but these ships were at the mercy of the ship captains and the merchants' interests. In both Marseille and Genoa, some captains saw the children's desperation as an opportunity. They promised to take them to Jerusalem, offering their ships in exchange for the children's faith. However, behind these promises lay dark intentions. In Marseille, two merchants, Hugo Ferrus and William Porcus, took hundreds of children aboard their ships. They promised to safely transport them to Jerusalem. But these words were nothing more than lies. The innocent children were taken to North Africa, where they were sold as slaves. Their faith in reaching the Holy Land became a tool to fill the pockets of these merchants. In Genoa, the situation was slightly different. The authorities in this city were more skeptical of the children's journey. Some leaders recognized the dangers of the movement and tried to prevent the children from boarding the ships. Yet even in Genoa's port, there were opportunistic captains. Some profited by transporting the children, while others led them toward even darker futures. Sea journey plans represented a new stage in the challenges the children faced. Battling hunger and exhaustion, these young souls now had to confront the unknowns of the sea. But most importantly, they were unaware of the betrayal that awaited them. In the ports of Marseille and Genoa, the children's fates were being shaped. Some disappeared in the cool waters of the Mediterranean, others were sold into slavery, and some could not continue the journey and had to return home. Yet, among them, a handful of children still clung to the dream of reaching the Holy Land. It meant more to them than it did to all of us at home. These ports were not merely structures made of stone and wood. They were mirrors reflecting people's hopes and disappointments. What happened in Marseille and Genoa not only told the story of these children, but also revealed both the dark and light sides of human nature. Now, I ask you, did these children do the right thing by pursuing their dreams? Or did their innocence leave them vulnerable to the world's harshness? Regardless of the answer, this story will remain one of the most poignant chapters in history. Ah, my children. One of the most brutal lessons in human history is how easily innocence can be exploited. The final chapter of the Children's Crusade writes the darkest lines of this lesson. As these innocent souls set sail from the ports of Marseille and Genoa, hoping to carry their dreams beyond the sea, they were unknowingly heading straight toward their own tragedy. In Marseille, when the merchants Hugo Ferrus and William Porcus boarded the children onto their ships, they promised them that they would reach the Holy Land. But these promises were nothing but lies. The ships did not sail toward Jerusalem, but instead steered toward the ports of North Africa. As the children crossed the vast waters of the Mediterranean, their dreams were shattered one by one. Upon reaching North Africa, these innocents were sold in the slave markets. Some were taken to Ottoman lands, others to the Mamluk palaces in Egypt. These children, now deprived of their freedom, had become mere commodities, bodies and labor to be bargained for. They were forced to spend the rest of their lives in foreign lands, enduring hardships beyond imagination. Some records suggest that a portion of these children were forced to work as slaves in Egypt and were trained as soldiers in the Mamluk army. The Mamluks had a powerful army composed of slaves, and some of these children, though unwilling, became part of this military system. However, most of them vanished without a trace in their new lives. Of course, it is impossible to know every detail of this tragedy. The records from that time are inadequate, incomplete, and often contradictory. The fate of the lost children is a riddle that even historians and researchers struggle to solve. Some believe that these children perished in the dark waters of the Mediterranean, while others claim they died from disease and hunger. But one thing is certain, most of these innocents never made it back home. Their families never learned the fate of their children. The young souls who left their homes became a sorrowful note in the dark pages of history. At this point, a painful question arises. Why were these children led to such a tragedy? Was it faith that drove them, or was it desperation? Some took advantage of their innocence, exploiting them for their own gain. But there were also silent onlookers who quietly witnessed these children's dreams. Both groups bear responsibility for this tragedy. So what can we learn from this story? Did humanity learn a lesson from the painful end of these innocents? Or do such tragedies still continue to unfold in different forms today? History is not only a mirror of the past, but also of the present and the future. The story of these children reminds us that innocence must be protected, faith must not be exploited, and that we must recognize and understand the darker aspects of human nature. Ah, my children, the spirits of these innocents still drift among the winds of history. Their story must never be forgotten. We must never forget, so that such a tragedy may never happen again. Ah, my children, history often begins with a whisper, and these whispers gradually turn into echoes. Yet, these echoes do not always carry the truth. The story of the Children's Crusade is one such echo, where historical facts intertwine with legends. Let's begin with the greatest legend of all, the word child. This word evokes notions of innocence and youth, but most historians agree that the Crusaders weren't composed solely of children. In the Middle Ages, the term child was also used to describe the poor, uneducated, or those of low status. So this movement was not just a pilgrimage of innocent young souls, but also a journey of desperate, impoverished individuals and hopeful young people. Chronicles tell us that the leaders of the Crusades saw visions and received divine calls. However, these accounts are more a reflection of the religious and cultural atmosphere of the time than a historical reality. Leaders like Nicholas from Germany and Stephen of Cloyes from France, for instance, have stories that are often embellished with miraculous elements. Whether these leaders truly saw visions or received divine messages can never be definitively proven. Another myth is that these children believed they would miraculously part the waters of the Red Sea and reach Jerusalem. This story might have been inspired by the biblical account of Moses parting the Red Sea. However, such stories are more likely products of religious propaganda and rumors that spread among the people. In reality, it is far more probable that these children vanished in the perilous waters of the Mediterranean or were sold into slavery. Another exaggeration in the Chronicles is that the movement began purely innocently and without any ill intentions. However, as previously mentioned, behind this movement were opportunistic merchants and individuals looking to exploit the situation for their own gain. The fact that traders in Marseille tricked the children and sold them into the slave markets clearly demonstrates how this innocent march was ruthlessly exploited. So the innocent march was ruthlessly exploited. Furthermore, there is much uncertainty about the scale of this event. Some chronicles claim that tens of thousands of children participated, while others suggest the number was much smaller. The lack of records from the time and the contradictory statements make it difficult for us to fully grasp the true scale of these events. End of section 3. So why did these myths emerge? People are often drawn to tragedies that involve innocence. The Children's Crusade is a powerful story that reflects both the innocence and the darker side of humanity. As a result, the tales told among the people tend to focus more on emotions than on the actual fact. History is not merely a timeline, it is also a way for humanity to tell its own story. These narratives sometimes distort the truth, sometimes embellishing it with legends. However, understanding these stories requires us to accept the past not as it was, but as it has become. Remember, my children, the truth often remains hidden in the shadow of the legend, but when you part this shadow, you discover the deepest aspects of humanity. The story of the Children's Crusade is not only a tragedy, but also a lesson, a warning. This lesson serves as a guide for every soul that seeks to understand the past. Ah, my children, the tragic story of the Children's Crusade did not simply occur and fade into oblivion. Instead, the echoes of this event spread throughout Europe and were discussed for many years. As people tried to understand the calamity behind this innocent march, it left deep marks on both the conscience of the Church and the common folk. First, let's talk about the reactions of the people. The common folk living in Europe's villages and towns had mixed feelings upon hearing of this event. Some admired the pure intentions of the children and saw them as innocent souls carrying out a divine mission. These individuals attributed the failure of the march to the lack of faith among the people or to God's test. However, another group saw this movement as nothing more than madness and desperation. As the tragic fates of the children became known, this perspective only grew stronger. As for the church leaders, this is where things get more complicated. The church at first was far from supportive of the movement. Pope Innocent III had clearly stated that it was wrong for children to participate in such a crusade. However, this stance did not stop the events from unfolding entirely. The church avoided taking responsibility for the tragic outcome and instead attributed the children's fate to the consequences of their own beliefs. Why? Some priests and preachers even used the tragedy as a tool to scare the people and reinforce the power of religious authority. How did these events affect medieval society? The Children's Crusade sparked a profound social and religious inquiry in Europe. People began to question the true intentions and consequences behind such movements. The role of merchants and opportunists in these events raised awareness of moral decay in society. On one hand, this tragedy showed how dangerously religious fervor could escalate in Europe. People believing they were acting in God's name failed to see how they were destroying innocent lives in the process. On the other hand, this event eroded the public's trust in the church. The church's inability to prevent such a major tragedy, or even its indirect support in some instances, caused people to question their respect for religious authority. However, there was another side to this story. The children's innocence and sacrifice became a symbol in the years to come in Europe. The event made people realize the need to protect innocence and balance religious fervor. The church, instead of trying to erase the tragedy, attempted to present it as a lesson. In sermons and stories, it was told that this event was God's test and that people needed to be more cautious in the future. My children, humanity must sometimes learn the painful lesson that even the most innocent intentions can lead to disaster. The Children's Crusade is one of the bitterest examples of this truth. It is not just a tragedy, but also an attempt by humanity to recognize its own flaws. Remember, history is a mirror not only of victories but also of mistakes. And this mirror reminds us to recognize past errors and take wiser steps in the future. My children, as we tell the story of the Children's Crusade, we not only see the tragedies of the past, but also the lessons humanity must learn. Now let's reflect on the historical significance of this event. The Children's Crusade is a mirror that reveals the social and religious structure of medieval Europe. The people of that time did not hesitate to follow their beliefs, yet sometimes these beliefs overshadowed logic and reality. The participation of children in this movement illustrates the fragility of the social structure and the intense belief in miracles of the time. In an era when the church's authority was strong, the uncontrolled spread of such a movement highlights both the positive and negative impacts of religion on the people. In the lives of many church members, the worst result was the great decline in morality. This event also helps us understand how social dynamics worked in medieval Europe. The children's departure on the crusade was not just a religious movement, but also a social explosion. Children from families struggling with poverty, hunger, and despair joined the crusade in hopes of a better life. This clearly shows how deep the economic inequalities and social issues were in Europe. Now, let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. The Children's Crusade is a reflection of the general failures of the Crusades. These children set out with the dream of rescuing Jerusalem and the Holy Lands, but tragically, just like the adult Crusades, they never reached their goal. This once again shows how the Crusades were often unplanned, chaotic, and sometimes disconnected from reality. However, this story is not just about a past full of failures, but also an example of how far humanity can go with faith and hope. The The innocence, beliefs, and courage of these children shine like a light through the dark pages of history. This light not only reminds us of past mistakes, but also shows us what humanity can achieve for the sake of goodness and hope. My children, history tells us not only about events, but also about the people and emotions behind them. The Children's Crusade is not just a tragedy, but a lesson in human history. This lesson teaches us to question our beliefs, protect innocence, and learn from the mistakes of the past. Now I leave you with a question. As you listen to the story of these innocent children, what lessons can you draw for your own lives? Perhaps this story gives us the opportunity to evaluate our beliefs and decisions more carefully. Ah, my children, the stories never end here. History is filled with thousands of events waiting to be told. Today we shared the story of these innocent children. Tomorrow we may meet again with another tale. Now go and reflect on this narrative. History continues to live not just in the past, but within us.